From a man whose voice on your eardrum is like a verbal key scratch on your car, this is the Daniel Natal Show. John McManus has a good article in the New American Magazine entitled, "NATO has always been part of the UN-led New World Order scheme." In it, he writes, "The United States became a founding member of the United Nations in 1945 when the Senate overwhelmingly approved the UN Charter. Most members of Congress who approved the UN's creation, like most of the American people, were sick of war and were fraudulently led to believe that the newly proposed world body would ensure peace." Peace? What's curious about this claim is that NATO was formally created in 1949, and by 1950, it had already instigated its first war. In James Perloff's book, The Shadows of Power, we learn more about it here. Did a secret purpose lie in the shadows of Korea? Dean Acheson later said, quote, "The only reason I told the president to fight in Korea was to validate NATO." End quote. Validating the UN was probably more to the point. In 1952, Foreign Affairs ran a lead article entitled Korea in Perspective, in which the author summed up thus, quote, "The burden of my argument then, based on the meaning of our experience in Korea as I see it, is that we have made historic progress toward the establishment of a viable system of collective security." End quote. So the Korean conflict never had to happen. It was the first time that war was done by bypassing Congress, who, according to the Constitution, were the only body that could authorize a war, and it set the precedent that the UN could control American troops. It was also important for the globalists because it was the first time that they made the assertion that a treaty could be used to short-circuit the Constitution. What one has to understand is that transnational financial interests wanted to set up a post-World War II world government, all the while lying to the public and telling them that such a thing was a crazy conspiracy theory. But consider Aristotle. In politics, he says that all governments have three main functions. 1. Doing infrastructure. 2. Establishing a judiciary. And 3. Maintaining a military. So what the Atlanticist banking grid did was brilliant. They created global institutions to carry out these functions, and then snapped them together like Lego blocks later on to form their world government scheme. In terms of doing infrastructure, they created the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to give out loans for building projects. For judiciary, they established the World Court in The Hague in 1946, right after World War II. And as for military, that was NATO in 1949. Hear James Perloff talk about it here. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formally established in 1949, has always been explained to Americans as an anti-communist alliance. But the CFR's definition is far less narrow. It regards all regional organizations as building blocks of world government. This frame of reference was expressed in Foreign Affairs as early as 1926, when Edward Benish wrote, quote, "Locarno, a European collective security agreement, represents an attempt to arrive at the same end by stages, by treaties and local regional pacts which are permeated with the spirit of the Geneva Protocol. These to be constantly supplemented until at last, within the framework of the League of Nations, they are absorbed by one great world convention guaranteeing world security and peace by the enforcing of the rule of law in interstate life." End quote. Shortly after American entry into NATO was ratified by the U.S. Senate, in a pamphlet called The Goal is Government of All the World, Elmo Roper of the CFR mused, quote, "But the Atlantic Pact, NATO, need not be our last effort toward greater unity. It can be converted into one more sound and important step working toward world peace. It can be one of the most positive moves in the direction of one world." End quote. So, despite telling the public that claims of a one-world government and a so-called New World Order were crazy conspiracy theories to lull the public into apathy and disengagement, they quietly set about creating the building blocks for such a world government through global organizations set up after World War II. Of course, the pretext that NATO was organized to fight communism are discredited since after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO never went away. In fact, it expanded. So what NATO represented was the Atlanticist banking grid's enforcement arm. It was the way that they projected power after World War II. And this is why the globalists were panicking when Trump got into power and openly started questioning NATO and America's involvement in it. Not only was he undermining and defunding it, but he was going after other globalist organizations as well. In other words, he was striking at the very roots of the post-World War II Bretton Woods international order, which he denounced for its false song of globalism.
No country has ever prospered that failed to put its own interests first. Both our friends and our enemies put their countries above ours. And we, while being fair to them, must start doing the same. We will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism. The nation state remains the true foundation for happiness and harmony. I am skeptical of international unions that tie us up and bring America down, and will never enter. And under my administration, we will never enter America into any agreement that reduces our ability to control our own affairs.
In a recent interview on Firing Line, former ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Yovanovitch, a globalist and no-Trump supporter, slipped up and admitted that if Trump were president, the current war in Ukraine probably wouldn't be happening.
President Trump has claimed that this invasion, quote, never would have happened in the Trump administration. I've heard that you have also suggested that Putin might not have gone to war if Trump was still in office. And you said, quote, you don't need to go to war if you're getting everything you want through other means. Tell me what you meant by that.
Trump was very dismissive of NATO. I mean, dismissive is obviously a diplomatic word, very critical of NATO, critical of our allies. And his close associates, including John Bolton, have said that if he had won a second term, he would have pulled us out of NATO. I mean, why go to war if you're Vladimir Putin, if the United States is going to present, kind of the corpse of NATO on a silver platter? You don't need to do that.
How do you think the invasion would have been different if Trump had remained as president?
I think that Trump would have provided Putin with enough of what he wanted that, perhaps he wouldn't have invaded.
It doesn't take a genius to understand now why the powers that be wanted Trump out immediately, and why events were orchestrated to bring about the installation of less curious parties who would carry out the orders of the Atlanticist banking establishment. Once Trump was gone, they reasserted NATO's power by engaging in provocations with Russia and Eastern Europe. Recently, Sweden and Finland signaled that they would submit papers to join NATO, a move that Russia said would lead to further destabilization of Europe. In a previous video we cited a Federal Reserve white paper entitled Measuring Geopolitical Risk by two Italian economists, Daria Caldara and Matteo Iacoviello. In it, the economists say, high geopolitical risk leads to a decline in real activity, lower stock returns, and movements in capital flows away from emerging economies and towards advanced economies. This last sentence bears repeating. Geopolitical risk leads to movements in capital flows away from emerging economies and towards advanced economies. What this means is that if you're a wealthy person from Peru and a civil war breaks out, you're going to want to get your money out of your country fast. So the tendency is to transfer it to the safe haven of the West, to a bank in Switzerland or Germany or the United States. This will be true of instability in various forms, from uprisings in Egypt to calamities in Colombia to insurgencies in Indonesia. All the wealthy people shift their assets from the developing world to the first world. So what NATO's mission is, as the enforcement arm of the Western banking grid, is to destabilize the world. They don't even have to stage coups that'll be successful. The sole point is to cause instability, thus instigating money flows from the poorer countries to the NATO countries to paper over our own collapsing economic system. This, needless to say, is not why the US military was instituted. So we have to reassess them being used in any NATO fighting force and being under the command of so-called UN bureaucrats and bankers. The New American Magazine is guided by our support of the U.S. Constitution and the principles upon which the Constitution is based. We want to restore and retain the values and vision that made America great: limited government, the freedom that a republic guarantees, and the personal responsibility a free people must exercise to stay free. To learn more or to subscribe to our magazine, visit thenewamerican.com.